Amen.
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 So it's been really nice, although I've been a bit sporadic in how we do these, but kind of slowly working through the last week of Jesus's life, doing these online sessions, because whenever we do the live days, the focus is on building little models, and there's a lot to squeeze into one day. And the nice thing by doing this, having a kind of an hour each time we take it, is we can kind of give proper space to the events of Jesus's last week, and just kind of see what we kind of see a little bit behind them as you kind of stop and think about them a bit slower. So we the last time we were together, we were looking at the end of Palm Sunday, and so we the kind of final slide I think we were looking at is as we noticed that very often in kind of our in common thinking, the triumphal entry is immediately followed by the clearing of the temple. And we get that impression from the way we read Matthew's Gospel, and we'll think about that this evening. But actually, Mark is very kind of clear. He gives us a clear kind of marker that says, "So Jesus entered into the temple." This is after the events of Palm Sunday, and when he'd looked around, because it was evening, he went back to Bethany, or went out to Bethany with the 12. So we understand from reading Mark that although we don't get that impression from Matthew, there is actually a break, an overnight break. And so as we then kind of put the pieces together again, the Monday, which kind of is this kind of fresh start, it's the Monday morning. It's the 30th of March, 33 AD. Jesus is back in kind of Bethany with all of his disciples, with Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. And they set out in the morning, this time without the donkey. Oh dear. Sometimes, yes, my title. One of the things I've noticed when I do a presentation on here, it readjusts things. So apologies that the title is kind of overlaying the subtitle there. It says Jesus owns the temple for a day. This is on the first Monday, and so the things we're going to look at on this Monday. Pardon me for my throat. Jesus is going to curse the fig tree on the way in. He's going to clear out the traders in the temple. He's going to heal the blind and the lame. And then we're actually going to see that's where the beginning of the plotting starts. Because actually on the Sunday, although Jesus has caused a huge stir as he's gone through the crowds, and if you remember, is he's gone through the crowds and suddenly people have realized who he is. People have heard about him by reputation. He's traveling in with Lazarus, and the word has gone out that he's there with Lazarus. So while there's been a huge amount of energy being kind of generated, towards the end of that day, as we pick it up from John's Gospel, and again, there's a little bit is how you fit the pieces together. But I understand on that day is the most likely day that Jesus meets the contingents of Greeks. And the Greeks who have come to worship at the temple, and they meet him, and Philip brings them via Andrew. And it says at the end of that process that Jesus kind of disappears from them. He kind of sneaks off. And it kind of then explains a little bit how when we read in Mark's Gospel, him coming into the temple and looking around, he's able to go quietly. Is that in the heat of the moment with all the masses of crowds outside, he's somehow managed to slip away from public attention. And in days before everyone knows what somebody looks like, if there's not a lot of commotion, he can probably still slip around quite kind of surreptitiously or quite kind of invisibly without people realizing exactly who he is. So he's gone in. So now the crowds, although they were excited on the previous day, on Monday morning, they don't know exactly where Jesus is coming from or exactly where he's going. And without making a kind of a scene by taking the donkey, Jesus is able to make his way in with the disciples into Jerusalem. And as he's walking there towards the temple, we have that kind of the famous little incident. Jesus sees a fig tree. Fig trees actually have a kind of an unusual ripening pattern. It's one of these things that it's not difficult to discover its kind of strange ripening pattern, but you do hear people criticizing Jesus for saying, well, if he goes, it's not the season for figs. Why is he complaining if there's no figs on the tree? Whatever, they make this fuss. And it just kind of shows a sort of a basic kind of ignorance of the way that figs work. And because figs are pollinated unusually, they're actually wasps that kind of pollinate them, and they'll pollinate right the way through the kind of the fruitful season. And as it gets near the end of the season, the buds will start to grow, and then they'll shut down. They'll kind of hibernate. And so when spring comes, although it's too early because it's not the fresh season, some of the fruit that kind of had just started to kind of grow, but then kind of went into hibernation for the over the winter months, and will start to kind of expand itself and to become edible. So it's not fully a fig, but it's kind of a fig bud, and it is edible. It's sweet and so on. So what Jesus is looking for is that it's the beginning of the season. It's spring. It's too early for in the year for the full fig harvest. But the things that have been sitting on the tree dormant since the previous summer are now just starting to soften up. They won't actually grow into full ripe figs, so they're edible at this stage, and that's what Jesus is looking for. As he approaches it, and as we know the story, he declares it being dead, and over the next couple of days, the disciples notice it's withered. And then Jesus actually tells his disciples to treat the fig tree as a prophetic sign. So Matthew 24. And of course, we know that because obviously, as the fig tree comes back into season, people associated it with the re-emergence of Israel from the late 40s through into the 60s, and the things that were going on there, and so on. So the fig tree has become a symbol, a prophetic sign of Israel, which is actually something that Jesus tells his disciples to do. So we'll look at the details a little bit as they're going in. So on the next day. If you remember, those of you who were able to get to one of the live sessions where we've done this, you'll recognise the text is from the manuals that we produce, where I integrated all 4 of the Gospels, and we did it in a colour-coded way. So we're using that again. So this story is told to us by Matthew and Mark. So Matthew is in purple, Mark is in blue, and the black text tells us it's in both of those 2 Gospels. And it's interesting to notice how easily the 2 fit together. The only thing to notice in here is that Matthew's is a little bit out of order, as we're going to see in a minute. The next incident, we're going to go back in time, and that it's part of this in terms of how we've thought about the Gospels emerging. Matthew, as we see the early church telling us, is written first. And he's written from a very non-personal kind of point of view. He's written a gospel that is for all believers, and it's kind of got discipleship material in there, and it's the official, if you like, version. And whereas Mark is a version of Matthew, but it's the version told more personally by Peter while he's in Rome, which is why they're so similar, but why there's less in Mark, because it's perhaps Peter's favourite preaching passages, but the bits where there is less, he gives kind of more eyewitness detail to. See, all fits. But in that context, Matthew has kind of told the story. Matthew has told the story of the triumphal entry, and then he has instantly told the story of the clearing of the temple, and then he tells the story of the fig tree. And because we're very chronologically driven, we kind of see one thing happens and then the next, and we miss the night out because Matthew hasn't mentioned it. And then we see the fig tree, you see, and he turns the fig tree from a 2-day experience. He just describes it as one day. He just says Jesus did this and it happened immediately. But actually that's much more in line with Matthew's approach. He's not trying to give a kind of the chronological an hour by hour, blow by blow. He's telling incidents, and he's packaging incidents together. And actually, if you read it, it says in the morning when he returned to the city, and it doesn't tell us whether that was the previous morning or this morning. So you can read Matthew, just understand he's saying on the previous morning he'd said this, and the fig tree died immediately, and this is what people thought about it. Hopefully that makes sense. If you put the 2 side by side, you'll see what I mean. But the funny thing is, even though there's that kind of slight difference in terms of the big scale order, when you fit the text together, it works very well. So now the next day, when they'd come out from Bethany in the morning, as he returned to the city, he was hungry, seeing a fig tree far off or by the road, having leaves. He came to it to see if he might find anything on it. So the fact it's got leaves means spring has kind of caused it to spring into life, and so those partially developed figs from last year should now be sweet. And he found nothing on it but leaves, because it wasn't the season for figs. So there was obviously everything from last year had gone. So Jesus said to it, or told it, you see the different varieties I've got there, Let there be no fruit from you now forever. May no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples heard it, and immediately the fig tree withered away. So that last phrase is from Matthew, which gives the impression it all happens in one morning. But it's just, as we touched on this before, it's very, Hebrew is an Aramaic, it's very kind of dramatic language. It doesn't give you a sense of the passage of time in quite the same way that we would do in English. And really all that Matthew, I think, here is saying is it's not that it happens instantly, but actually from that moment the fig tree is died. That's the point he's making. It's the end of what it was and what it meant prophetically. But then as we go on, when he had come into Jerusalem, all the city was stirred up and said, "Who is this?" And the multitude said, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee." And Jesus entered into the temple. You see now we've got some green in the mix because we're integrating some things. In fact, it looks like there's only one word in green, which is the word he, but Luke is also in some of the black text, because the black text just tells us that it's in more than one gospel. He entered into the temple and began to drive or throw out those who sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of those that sold the doves. And he wouldn't allow anyone to carry a container through the temple. And he taught them, saying, "Isn't it written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." And it's this incredibly dramatic moment. We've read about a similar incident in John's Gospel, which Jesus started his ministry with. And I think there's a very deliberate revisiting, because John's Gospel, it's not included in the Synoptics, because the Synoptic Gospels have all chosen to start Jesus' ministry with his tours in Galilee. But as we've looked at the whole of kind of Jesus' life and ministry, if you've been to any of those sessions, we'll see there is actually a good 9 months, or maybe even towards a year, of material that we can build together from hints in Luke and a lot more in John's Gospel. There's been a good 9 months to a year of ministry before that, of things that were going on before the actual public tours of Galilee start. And so in that context, which isn't covered in the Synoptic Gospels, we know from John's Gospel, Jesus has cleared the temples, turned over the money tables, but then he doesn't have a big crowd and a big following. So he kind of effectively turns over the tables, but the temple guard moves straight in on him. What Jesus is doing he's not unique in doing it. Other people have caused troubles because the markets, or the bazaars of Annas, as they were known, are incredibly unpopular with the Jewish population, and pilgrims regularly get angry because they've travelled for miles. They get there, they're having their money exchanged at extortionate rates, they're having sacrifices sold to them at extortionate rates, and so it's not unusual for someone to get annoyed and angry and get a bit difficult. And Jesus is treated in the same way. He's just treated as some sort of hothead who's kind of getting upset about how much things cost. And so in that context, at the beginning of John's Gospel, he's just been kicked out of the synagogue. Not out of the synagogue, out of the temple. But now, of course, we saw yesterday these huge crowds that have been developing with him and kind of growing in terms of the numbers that are joining him. And so actually that's not such a realistic possibility, and so Jesus is able to kind of make a much bigger event of this occasion, and in it there is a kind of a prophetic sort of moment. So I've got a comment here. So people are waiting expectant. The comment on the context. We got several verses. There's a number of incidents in Jesus' life, just as we saw last time when we looked. Zechariah's verse, "Behold, your king comes to you humble and seated on a donkey." Actually, there's quite a lot of messianic expectation tied up with that verse in the intertestamental period, and similarly, the events that Jesus is kind of modelling now with the temple have various threads or kind of prophetic context to them. So obviously there's the Haggai verse, and that's an interesting one. We'll think about all of these in a minute. I'll shake all the nations, the wealth, I put / desire of nations will come, and will fill this house with glory, says Yahweh of hosts. That's Haggai. Zechariah, on that day there will no longer be a trader in the house of Yahweh who rules over all. We'll think about all of these in a second. In this house which is called by my name has become a den of robbers in your eyes. Behold, even I have seen it, says Yahweh. That's Jeremiah. And that, of course, is ignoring the verse that's being quoted, that my house should be a house of prayer for the nations, but you've made it a den of robbers. We're kind of actually here in Jeremiah, God's seen it, it's become a den of robbers. And do you remember when we were looking last time? Part of the significant thing of that Palm Sunday journey into Jerusalem was the presence of Greeks, as John pointed out. And John, who's written his gospel last, I think, has told us that story because he wants to give some context to the events that kind of follow. The clearing of the temple, just the whole. He knows that everyone's read about that because they've had the synopsis. He knows what's in them, so he's included the story there of the presence of the Greeks because it allows us to see this context that the house that should have been a house of prayer for all nations, not that they're praying for the nations, but that anyone from any nation can come in there and pray. But that courtyard where they could do that, they can't go into because it's a huge market that's making huge amounts of money at this stage. So all of this is kind of part of the background as we're working through. So if we think about I will shake the nations, this is an aside on Haggai's prophecy, I'll shake the nations. And I've kind of translated it here that the precious thing, it's a singular precious thing, the precious thing of all nations will come and I will fill the house with glory, says Yahweh of armies. And you can actually translate the Hebrew word that I've kind of called there the precious thing. And depending on your English translation, you'll see it kind of is taken one of two ways. And that's not a mistake in one translation or another. It actually represents the ambiguity of the Hebrew. So the actual Hebrew is a kind of a singular precious thing. So is that the wealth of nations, is because wealth is a singular precious thing, you see? Or is it the desire of nations? Is it the thing that they desire? And actually, from a grammatical point of view, it could be either equally. But actually, if it's the first, if it's the wealth of nations, then the priests who run the temple would probably see what they're doing as being a fulfillment of this verse. Because what's happening is people are coming from all over the world because there are Jewish communities now all over the known world. And actually, along with the real Jewish pilgrims, they're bringing guests with them to kind of have a look at what's going on. And as they bring all of their money from every part of the empire, they're having to exchange it at exorbitant rates. And so the wealth of nations really is kind of pouring into the temple. And it's becoming part. The temple has never looked better than it does today. It's estimated that it was covered in white marble and gold leaf right the way over. So everything you're looking at is gold leaf or white marble. It's incredibly wealthy, kind of opulent location now, and it's got rich by this whole process. You see, so you could imagine as a kind of as one of the priests who runs the temple, part of the family of Annas, that here we are, we're fulfilling that verse, and yet there's this kind of way in which it gets turned around. And so as we sing in the carol, isn't it? Come, desire of nations, come. It's a call for Jesus to return, because actually we understand Jesus as the precious thing that actually the nations would really value. And actually, as we see how fast the Christian faith grows into the Gentile world, it is a kind of an evidence that works itself out over the next 300 or so years, is actually how the nations are incredibly receptive to the way in which they are able to be lifted from paganism and to join in the worship of Yahweh without the loss of their kind of other elements of their culture, which is an incredible kind of thing. So Jesus is the desire of nations rather than the wealth of nations. It's a different prophetic take on the same verse, put it that way. So I've got all of that on there. So that's kind of going on. It's part of the mix. Oops. Let's keep moving. If you kind of read on in that passage, all the nations that came against Jerusalem will go out from year to year to worship the King of Yahweh of armies. And then it goes on and says, yes, every pot in Jerusalem and in Judah will be holy to Yahweh, because in that day there'll no longer be a trader. I put there, normally, often you read it says Canaanite. But I've highlighted Proverbs 31 verse 24 because Canaanites, it's a kind of one of those words. Canaanites were used for, they were the traders of the ancient world, and so sometimes the word for a Canaanite is an ethnic thing, and sometimes it's to do with what they're doing, which is trading. And they used to kind of work, the Midianites who were Canaanites. They used to kind of trade along the old Fertile Crescent. And so actually sometimes scripture it doesn't make sense to say ethnic Canaanite, because it's much more about what they're doing and it's about trade. And so there's in that verse, what it's saying is in this kind of context of Zechariah's prophecy where the nations are coming. Hang on, let me just go and remind myself of the exact reference. Where are we? Yeah, so one was Zechariah. Sorry, I'm getting myself confused. That's why I went back to check myself. It's not Haggai, not in the context of Haggai's prophecy. In the context, sorry, of Zechariah's prophecy here is the prophecy of, "Behold, your king comes to you humble and seated on a donkey." In the context of that prophecy, which we thought of last time, was seen in a lot of Jewish circles as having been fulfilled by Alexander the Great. Because if you take the run of the prophecies, it lists 6 or 7 places that actually Alexander conquered as he ran down the coast. And as he got down to kind of just a little bit south of where Jerusalem was, he kind of then turned inland and started heading towards Jerusalem, was going to kind of conquer Jerusalem. And because of a dream, the high priest of the day went out in festal robes and with singers, and they welcomed him, took him into the temple and showed him kind of prophecies about himself. And as a result, he offered the sacrifice to Yahweh and left and didn't destroy Jerusalem, you see. And in the context of that, Zechariah had taken that event and used it as the framework to prophesy when Jerusalem's king comes, not the foreign king, but Jerusalem's king, you see. And in that context, you see, here he then goes on in that way and says, all the nations that came against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King of Yahweh's of armies. Alexander the Great, as a Greek, had been the first. He was the first one that went up and he actually worshipped. And from John's Gospel, we've picked up the story that there were actually Greeks there wanting to get into the temple and to worship the Lord. But of course, at the moment, they can't. And actually, the reason they can't is actually because of the opposite of this verse in Zechariah. Because the context of this verse in Zechariah, I've only kind of, you've noticed lots of dots. I've missed various bits out. Is that actually there's so many people coming to worship that even just any old pot that you can find in Jerusalem is now being treated as holy so that it can be used to offer offerings to God, you see. So the context is now so many people are coming that actually the utensils for offering sacrifices can't be special anymore. Just any old pot will have to do. And actually there won't need to be a trader or a Canaanite. And so it's this kind of double meaning. So at one level, the priests have been excluding those foreigners because they've made it so kind of special. But actually, what it's supposed to have been is that there shouldn't be a need to trade and sell in the court of the Gentiles, because actually every pot now has become holy to the Lord, which is a wonderful kind of prophetic image of the Messianic age. So I've got there, Zechariah promised about the Greeks with Alexander coming against Jerusalem. So he's right in there. He's the nations that have come against Jerusalem in this kind of context. And of course, then we've got the reference in this house, which is called by name, has become a den of robbers. This is Jeremiah. And actually, if we go and look at those verses, actually they precede a warning of the destruction of the temple. So now Jeremiah 7:11, if you look at 12 to 14, go now to my place which was in Shiloh. So if you remember the Old Testament history, is before Jerusalem was established as the centre of worship, Shiloh was the centre of worship. And when the nation of Israel and Judah split into two nations, Shiloh was one of the kind of the cult centre, with the centre of northern worship, just as the temple became the centre of southern worship in Judah. So actually in that context, Jeremiah says, now go and look at the place of Shiloh and see what I did to it for the wickedness of my people Israel. And I'm going to do the same to this house which is called by my name, in which you trust, and to the place to which I gave you and your fathers, just as I did to Shiloh. So Jeremiah's context is to say, go and have a look. Just because God's name was there and just because it was a centre of worship, it doesn't exist anymore. And of course he gives these words in warning for the destruction of the first temple. But actually they look like they fit again as we come to this period, which is just going to lead to the destruction of the second temple. So Jeremiah's prophetic word kind of has a double moment. It worked the first time and it's going to come around again for this season. So now kind of having established that space, it's taken the temple guards by surprise. Although Jesus was doing a lot outside yesterday, they're probably aware of what was going on outside, but they hadn't expected it to be brought right into the temple. And in that context, Jesus clearly has the upper hand. He has the initiative during this week. And so in that context, we're going to read about he heals the blind and the lame. Children can proclaim him as the Son of God. It's where he quotes Psalm 8, and he puts himself in Yahweh's role as he does that, which of course will really upset the temple authorities. And so then we very specifically read about the priest starting to plot against him. And I put there, it's just still 2 days before his arrest, which is the way it's described. These events are described in Matthew and Mark. So we'll look at what the text actually says. Again, it's the integrated text, but in this one there's only text from Matthew. So the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. When the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things he did, and the children who were crying out in the temple, saying, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they were really indignant and said to him, "Don't you hear what these kids are saying?" And Jesus said, "Yes, and didn't you ever read, out of the mouth of babes and nursing babes, you have perfected praise." And again, it's one of those little. So as I say, yes, Jesus made that comment, out of the mouth of babes and nursing babes, you perfected praise. And if you kind of go and look at the context of that, it's from Psalm 8. Psalm 8 kind of starts verse 1. So for the chief musicians on the instrument of Gath, it's a kind of a strange Hebrew word. That's the way this translation has put it. A psalm of David, and it starts, "Yahweh, your Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth." And so actually to understand that when Jesus says this to them, because they say, "Stop all the noise, stop all the celebrations," he says, "Haven't you heard it said that, out of the mouth of babes and suckling children I've ordained for myself praise?" And he's quoting Psalm 8, but you look at the context, and the context is praise to Yahweh. So it's a very provocative statement when Jesus says it. It's not just a generic praise, it's actually praise towards God. And although he's not explicitly said, "I'm God," it is the praise that he's drawing, it's the activity that he's doing, it's the healing of the lame and so on that is causing this praise. And so he's putting himself very clearly in that flow, which is in its own way is a very challenging statement to the authorities. Because he's showing people, he's effectively claiming a new way for praise to be offered to the Lord, or he's making himself the Lord. Either way, they wouldn't be very happy with it. So he's set glory above the heavens, from the lips of babes and infants you've established strength. Jesus changes that to praise, and that's fine. Sometimes we get hung up on the slight changes of words, but remember, there's never an exact one-to-one between languages, and therefore how you translate is a little bit of a kind of a personal understanding. Jesus has chosen a word in Greek, or he's used a word that the Greek record translates as praise, whereas the original is strength, but it's that kind of sense of encouragement that comes with praise. And so it's interesting because it goes on and says, "Because of your adversaries, that you might silence the enemy and the vengeful." That's literally the word, the vengeful. And so I put there, of course, it's this that causes the vengeful priests to start plotting. It's the children's praise are kind of actually messing up what the worship that that those who are adverse to Jesus would want, and actually they are themselves both enemies of God and vengeful. If you think of it like that, you can see there's a kind of greater sense of fulfillment in that verse than sometimes we perhaps realise just that little quote. So when the chiefs and the priests and the scribes heard it, they thought that they might destroy him, you see, because it's a very provocative thing, as I said. And they feared him because of the multitude, was astonished at his teaching. So when evening came, he left them and went out of the city to Bethany, and he lodged there. And then we get a little summary from Luke, and he was teaching daily in the temple, but the chief priests and the scribes and the leading men among the people sought to destroy him. So it's a little behind the scenes. This is now happening in those absent moments, but they couldn't find what they should do because everyone hung on every word that he said. So the next morning, I said we'd do Monday, but we'll do Tuesday as well. Which I call Tag Team Tuesday, because they've been trying to work out how to deal with Jesus, and it does seem on Tuesday that they found a successful means, a successful way of dealing with Jesus. And so what happens is we have a kind of at the start of the day they revisit the fig tree, which is now withered. Then there's a kind of this series, as I refer to it, as Tag Team Tussles, where different parts, different factions, Sadducees, Herodians, Pharisees, they're kind of coming one after the other and with questions for Jesus, which means that although Jesus never kind of gets swamped by those questions, he doesn't have the initiative that he had on the Monday, and which perhaps explains why we don't really read about anything on the Wednesday. Perhaps he realizes that his moment in the temple is now finished, and actually we're now moving towards the very final act of the last week. So in the afternoon of Tuesday, Jesus is going to have left the temple totally, and instead he teaches sitting on the Mount of Olives, looking back at the temple. And of course, it's that evening that he has probably, it's most likely the time when he has the meal at Simon's house, where he's anointed by Mary. But we looked at that a few weeks back, so we probably won't look at that in great detail. We'll kind of focus on beyond there, but. So we won't cover it tonight, in other words, because there's a lot to say about it, and we've already looked at it. So it happened on one of those days, as Luke's way of putting it, as they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away from the roots. And when the disciples saw it, they marvelled, saying, "How did the fig tree immediately wither?" And Peter, remembering, said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered away." And Jesus answered them, "Most certainly I tell you, whoever has faith in God, and you don't doubt in his heart, but believes what he says is happening, he shall never... what is happening? He shall have whatever he says. And you not only do this, not only will this be done to the fig tree," so I'm reading the tiny little text, "but even if it was told to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, it would be done. So I tell you, all things, whatever you pray and ask for, believe that you've received them, and you shall have them. And whenever you stand praying, forgive, and if you have anything against anyone, that your Father who's in heaven forgive, so that if you have anything against anyone, your Father who's in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses or transgressions. But if you don't forgive, neither will your Father in heaven forgive your transgressions." So there's kind of quite a rich, as you match all the three Gospels there who tell us this story, you put all the different bits together, it produces quite a rich teaching, which is all driven by them seeing the tree has withered. And so it touches on issues of faith because of the kind of the miracle that seemed to have happened. It touches on how you pray. But I think for tonight, I just wanted to kind of focus really on the kind of the question. There's a question that comes up, which is kind of highlighted a little bit by the things that happen when he gets to the temple. So there's the fig tree, because he's going to tell stories about a vine there as well. So we get fig tree and vine combination. So they came again to Jerusalem, and when they'd come into the temple, and he was walking and teaching and people and preaching the good news, and the chief priests and the scribes and the elders asked, or came to him saying, "Tell us, by what authority you do these things, or who gave you the authority to do these things?" And Jesus answered them, "I'll ask you one question, which if you can tell me, I likewise will tell you by what authority I do these things. So the baptism of John, was it from heaven or was it from men? Answer me." And they reasoned with themselves, saying, "If we say it's from heaven, he's going to ask us, why then didn't you believe him? But if we say from men, we fear the multitude, and the people will stone us, because they are persuaded that John was a prophet." And they feared the people, so they answered and said, "We don't know who it's from." And Jesus said, "Well, in that case, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." And then he began to speak to them in parables. So what do you think? And this is now the first vineyard parable. It's parable number 1. So they've come with this question, which is a tricky question. Just quickly jumping back, on authority. He's answered it. He then Jesus tries to take the initiative. He tells a parable. He began speaking. "What do you think? A man had 2 sons. He said to the first, 'Come and work in the vineyard.' And he said, 'I'm not going to.' And afterwards he changed his mind and went. And then he came to the second and said the same thing. He said, 'I will go, sir.' But then he didn't go. Which one did the will of his father?" And they said, "The first." And Jesus said to them, "Most certainly I tell you that tax collectors and prostitutes are entering the kingdom of heaven before you. Because John came in the way of the righteousness and you didn't believe him." So he's kind of answering the question he's posed to them. Whose authority was John working under? And actually it's the tax collectors and prostitutes who believed him. And when you saw it, you didn't even repent afterwards that you might believe. In other words, they came late to the party, but they actually did what they were supposed to, unlike you. And then Jesus goes on and tells another parable about a vineyard. So vineyard parable 2. And he began to tell them this parable. There's another parable. There was a man who has a master of a household, and he planted a vineyard. He set a hedge about it. He dug a pit for the winepress. He built a tower. He rented it out to a farmer or some farmers. He went to another country for a long time. When it was time, as the proper season for the fruit to draw near, he sent his servants to the farmers. And you know the story. I won't try and read it all. And they killed first wave, and then they stoned the first wave, killed the second wave, and eventually sends the son. So he sent a third, and they wounded him and threw him out, and another, and they killed him, many others, beating some and killing some. And so afterwards, still having won his beloved son, the Lord of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I'll send my beloved son. See, they'll respect him. They'll respect my son." But when the farmers saw the son, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Come on, let's kill him." So they took the stones and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. And Jesus said, "So when the Lord of the vineyard comes, what will he do to the farmers?" And they told him he'll merely they told him he would miserably destroy those miserable men and will lease out the vineyard to other farmers, who will give him fruit in due season. And Jesus responded, "He will come and destroy the farmers and will give the vineyard to others." And when they heard it, they said, "May this never be," because they realize now Jesus is applying the vineyard parable to Jerusalem or to the temple system at this stage. And it fits very well now with the story of the fig tree that, of course, we've just read. It was cursed the day before, and on the morning where he's teaching this parable about the vineyard that's going to be given to others, there is because we find a couple of prophetic references to the health of Israel and the health of vines and fig trees. So vines and fig trees kind of put together in the Old Testament, in the prophetic context, are often a sign of security and blessing. So I've given you one example there, but which is from Kings, but you've got ones in Micah and Zechariah. So Judah and Israel lived safely, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, all the days of Solomon. You see, it's this idea that something about stability and security is that the vine and the fig tree, and everybody has access to them. They all have their own version, and they all have their own fig tree, their own vine. But it's also used prophetically as a sign of judgment. You see, "I will utterly consume them," says Yahweh. So there will be no grapes on the vine. He's just been saying there are no grapes coming from the vineyard, nor will there be figs on the fig tree. Well, that happened yesterday. There were no figs on the fig tree, and people are talking about these things because Jesus has cursed it and it's withered. There were no figs on it, and now it's died. So they were very aware there's nothing on the fig tree. He told them a parable. There's nothing coming from the vineyard. "And so these things that I have given them shall pass away from them," says Jeremiah. And so it's kind of drawing this context into the actions and the teachings and the thing that Jesus is doing over this last week. There's part of the kind of the prophetic dialogue that is going on with him telling these stories, demonstrating these signs, involving people to try and understand what is going on and seeing what's happening. But anyway, Jesus then responds with telling them the story of the stone that's been rejected. And he then finishes this, "Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you, or given to a nation, bringing forth its fruit." So he kind of really makes it explicit. Here we go. Okay, so apologies about that another time. We were just finally saying that all of these things are kind of now coming together. So Satan's now entered into Judas. The priests have got their final push. They've decided how they're going to do it. They've got their plans are underway. And obviously this is the evening probably where Mary anoints Jesus, but we've covered that elsewhere, so we won't touch on it now. So when we next are together, we will we'll actually kind of then take a look at the kind of the Last Supper, really, the Wednesday through and Gethsemane is what we'll like to be looking at. But does anyone want to ask any questions for the video's sake? There's still 6 people here, so
No, I'm okay.
you're okay, Geraldine.